Okay, so in this video, we're going to look at how to determine the domain if you're given an equation. This is one of those things that look really, really hard until you know how to do it, and then you realize it's really not so bad. Okay, so let's begin. So there are two things that you have to remember in order to be able to determine the domain from an equation. The first one is that you're not allowed to have 0 in the denominator. So 0 is not in the denominator. So that's just a rule. We can't have 0 in the denominator because 5 divided by 0, what is that? You know, how many zeros go into 5? Really, what is that? All right, so just for that reason, no zeros in the denominator. So, all right, so let's say our function looks like this. We have f of x is equal to 3 over x plus 2. Well, right now, we do have a denominator, so that's helpful. So right now, we don't want our denominator to be equal to 0. Well, what would make our denominator equal to 0? Well, if this value here was negative 2, then our denominator overall would be equal to 0. So x cannot be negative 2 because that would make the whole thing equal to 0. So that's our domain, but let me just show the work just in case you missed that. So x plus 2 cannot be equal to 0. And solving an equation is just like solving an equation. So I can just go ahead and take 2 from both sides, and we get that x is not equal to negative 2. So that's one of our 2 rules of the domain. The other rule, let's turn the page. Okay, so our second rule is that we cannot take the square root of a negative number. No square root, or even root for that matter, of a negative. Now, yes, you may know that you can find the square root of an even number. The answer is not a real number. We have an imaginary number. Oh, yeah, you may learn this in the future. You may have already learned it. But for this purpose, when describing your domain, you are not allowed to have the square root or any even root of a negative number. So let's say our function is y equals the square root of 3 minus x. All right. We can actually have a 0 under the square root sign. So this whole thing here could be 0. What's the square root of 0? Square root of 0 is 0. Totally fine. But once this becomes less than 0, then we're in a bit of a problem. Like, what's the square root of negative 1? You may actually know the answer to that. It's imaginary. But again, we're not dealing with imaginary. So, because we are not allowed to have a negative square root here, x has to be, let's see. So let's write this down, let's solve it like the good, great mathematicians that we are. All right, so 3 minus x has to be positive, right? We agree? Okay, so how do we write positive? Greater than 0. Cool. All right, so now we can go ahead and add x to both sides. And we get that x is over there. It's a little awkward because we have it on the right side. But let's switch it around. X has to be less than 3. If x were greater than 3, then this thing here would be negative, no good. So that is our domain in this case. So those 2 cases are the 2 things that help us to figure out the domain when we have an equation. The first one, once again, our denominator cannot be 0. And our second one, under our square root sign, we cannot have a negative number. You know these 2 things, and you are all set to figure out the domain. So I just have to say, other than that, if you don't have a square root sign in your equation, and you don't have a denominator in your equation, then it's safe to say that everything else is fair game, and your domain in that case will be, I'll write this on the next slide. If x can be anything, it would be x is all real numbers. So if x can be anything, if there is no other limitations and x can be anything, we just write that x is all real numbers. All right, I hope that helped.